Welcome to Unmasking Government Schools with Sherry Few, US PI's weekly podcast that empowers parents to reclaim their children's education from government bureaucrats and social engineers. In each episode, Sherry delivers the latest news from the front lines of the fight for the minds of the next generation, equipping you with the tools and resources needed to join the cause.
Hi everyone, welcome to Unmasking Government Schools with Sherry Few. I'm your host, Sherry Few. Today we're digging into a heartbreaking and outrageous case from Rhode Island, where a public school secretly helped a young girl socially transition without telling her mother. The result? A devastating suicide attempt. Joining me to talk about this case and the legal action now underway is Mike Stenhouse, CEO of Rhode Island Center for Freedom and Prosperity. Before we get into it, please take a moment to give us a 5-star rating or a thumbs up, and be sure to subscribe to the show. And don't forget to visit uspi.org to learn more and join the movement.
Today's episode is brought to you by U.S. parents involved in education. U.S. PI's mission is to empower parents and local communities to break free from federal and national influences, thereby reclaiming parental authority over their children's education. For more insights from U.S. parents involved in education, connect with us at US PI on X and Facebook. To join the movement, visit uspi.org.
Welcome back to Unmasking Government Schools with Sherry Few. I'm your host, Sherry Few, and today's episode touches on every parent's worst nightmare, having your child's identity and well-being manipulated behind your back by a government institution. This is not fiction. It happened in Rhode Island, and it nearly cost a young lady her life. Here to walk us through the case and what it means for parental rights nationwide is Mike Stenhouse. Mike is a former Major League Baseball player who now leads one of the most dynamic policy organizations in the country, the Rhode Island Center for Freedom and Prosperity. His team recently filed a lawsuit against the state's Department of Education on behalf of Jane Doe, the girl's mother, and is fighting to repeal the regulation that enabled this secret transition. Mike Stenhouse, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much, Sherry. Great to be with you, and thank you for all you and your organization does. We're very good friends with your state chapter leader here in Rhode Island, Elena Beluso, so I want to give her thanks for setting up this interview, helping to anyway.
Yes. Elena does a great job, and I'm so glad that she's actually been on your podcast, and it's good to reciprocate, and I hope to be on soon to talk about this as well. So before we get into our topic, please tell our viewers a bit about your days as a baseball player and how you ended up leading the Rhode Island Center for Freedom and Prosperity.
I was pretty naive about everything, politics, girls, drinking, studying when I was in college. And then when I signed my professional contract in 1980, I played for 8 years, and it just happened to be the same 8 years that Ronald Reagan was elected and served his 2 administrations. So that's when I started taking an interest in politics. That's how I developed my conservative philosophy, and that's why Ronald Reagan today is my hero, especially after he led the downfall of the Soviet Union. So after I got out of baseball, I did a lot of different things. Never really couldn't find a comfort zone. I don't think I was in any one job for more than 3 years. But then in 2010, I got involved in a political campaign, and then I heard about an opening at the existing think tank in Rhode Island, and they were looking for an executive director, and I applied for it. I was granted the job. We had to shut down that think tank for internal political reasons, but then I started a brand new one in its wake, and I've been doing this now for 14 years, and I've been blessed to have a career in America's 2 favorite pastimes, politics and baseball.
Well, that's great. What a good combination. And I'm glad you got involved with politics, because I know you've been doing some great work there in Rhode Island. And Rhode Island obviously is a state where it's very challenging to be a conservative. So thanks for hanging in there. So let's dive right into the case that's been making headlines in Rhode Island. Can you walk us through what happened to Jane Doe and her daughter and how your organization got involved?
Ever since I started doing my own podcast, and this is my hat. Because of my baseball background, I call it In the Dugout with Mike Stenhouse. Our first real issue was not just the pandemic-related stuff and exposing all the false narratives that that so many of the establishment was putting forth. But then we, as most of the country learned that what the hell are they teaching our kids? It started off with the critical race theory type stuff, and pretty soon we got into the over sexualized content, and then the transgender LGBTQ stuff. So it became a focus of our center, and through that work, we decided, especially once we saw that Donald Trump might get reelected, we decided in our state, Sherry, it's really impossible to change legislation. It's just the preponderance of Democrats and progressive woke Democrats at that. It just makes it impossible. So our only chance to affect policy is through the court. So we're starting to form a law center underneath our own umbrella. We've got 3 great volunteer attorneys. We're looking to hire somebody. We've almost raised enough money, but the 3 great attorneys decided that we'd start looking into cases on this transgender because there's been a lot of public outcry on that here. And through a friend of ours in our coalition from the Moms for Liberty, the Moms for Liberty state chapter leader, we learned about this Jane Doe mother. And her story is as troubling as any I've heard across the nation. You and I both have heard many parents on national talk shows, media shows, TV. This is the most horrific story I've ever heard, and I thank you for covering it. We can take it wherever you would like to go next.
Okay, great. So, as you know, I wrote an op-ed about it, and it was published in Town Hall and another small publication. I was really glad to help in any way I could to publicize what's happening in this case. So one of the most disturbing parts of this case is how the school staff deliberately hid this from their mother. Actually told her that it was in her best interest to lie to her mother. So what exactly does the regulation from the Department of Education allow, and why do you believe it's unlawful?
I'm going to fill in a few backstory first, but to get to your point, so Jane Doe is a plaintiff in a lawsuit by our law center against the Rhode Island Department of Education. We're trying to repeal, both for her personal story and for legal reasons, which we'll get into a second, repeal their 2018 guidance to every school district in the state about their pro-transgender policies that they basically were forced to enact. But here's the backstory. This girl, Jane Doe's daughter, when she was 5 years old, was sexually assaulted by a relative of her now divorced husband, causing, as you can imagine, lifelong emotional issues. And this is what really makes you angry, is they took advantage of an emotionally disturbed young girl. They shoved this social emotional learning surveys constantly in her face. Are you happy in your body? Do you think you maybe should not be the gender that you think you are? All these questions. And until finally she decided when she was in 8th grade that, maybe I am in the wrong body, kind of stuff. And so she contacted school officials. We have emails. We have the emails that we had a fight like hell with the attorney to get the school district under the threat of a subpoena to turn over the information. And going back to her 8th grade, she kept saying, I want to change my name. I want to transition, blah, blah, blah. And then 2 years later, so she was living a double life, Sherry. She was a boy at school and she was a girl at home, and she was play acting probably both, and to a degree. And that's stressful. And 2 years later, the young girl tried to commit suicide right in front of her mother and her younger brother. She had cut herself up in a room, and she came downstairs where her mother and brother were and started stabbing herself in the arm. She was trying to slit her wrists right in front of them. And it wasn't until the hospital, when everyone started, what the heck happened here, that the mother learned about the transition. So there's a lot of implications there, but that's the story. So right now the lawsuit is to try to undo that regulation for 2 reasons, if you want me to continue on that.
Yeah, before you do that,
Okay.
state what the regulation is.
President Obama put forth transgender guidelines in 2016. The Rhode Island Department of Education next year said we're going to adopt those guidelines, and in 2018 they promulgated a rule that basically said here's how we want school districts to handle transgender and gender nonconforming students. So you have to form a support team. They tell you specifically you have to respect the student's privacy rights and wishes and medical confidentiality. And it specifically says, excuse me for looking away, but I'm reading here, district staff may not disclose information that may reveal a student's transgender status or gender nonconforming presentation to others, including but not limited to parents, students, volunteers, or other district staff, unless legally required to do so. In Rhode Island, the law basically says if you're in elementary school, you have to include the parents in that support, transgender support team. But if you're in middle school or higher, 8th grade, and you're a minor, which is, basically 6th, 7th grade higher, and this girl was in 8th grade, you don't have to inform the parents. In fact, the regulation says you specifically don't have to. So we're showing harm of this regulation. Obviously, this family has suffered enormous harm. And we're also claiming a legal technicality where in promulgating that regulation, 7, 8 years ago, the Rhode Island Department of Education purposely misstated state law in order to justify the regulation. They said every student by state law cannot be discriminated against on the basis of sex, gender identity, or gender preference. It only says sex in state law. And then it goes on to talk about sex as male and female. So they purposely manipulated state law, and now we can prove that this law and these policies at the local level have caused enormous harm to this one particular family, and who knows how many others.
Right. I'm sure there are indeed others. And so it kind of reminds me of under the Biden administration, how they tried to change the definition of sex in Title IX to include, LGBTQ. So I'm glad that the Supreme Court struck that down, and perhaps that will give some support to your case as well.
We do cite the president's executive orders. We do cite some of the other rulings in the complaint to support it, to support our claims. Our attorneys have since sent a letter to the Office of Civil Rights at the U.S. Department of Education, naming Department of Education, Rhode Island Interscholastic League, who does allow men to compete in girls' sports, Rhode Island Department of Education, 6 school districts, and the Attorney General. We named each of them for investigative referral to the Office of Civil Rights at the federal level. So the swamp is getting behind this whole thing in Rhode Island.
Right. And I've heard similar stories from other really liberal states like Washington and California, where they're just pushing back and refusing. And I think California even filed its own lawsuit against the Department of Justice. So it's interesting how the left states are just ignoring what is federal law. It's federal law through Title IX, and it's executive orders, I think, are considered federal law. So it's interesting how they're so dug in that they're just going to continue to deny what's already been decided by federal law.
The interesting addition to that is these school districts are admittedly stuck between a rock and a hard place. State law and the Attorney General and their Department of Education are saying do this. Federal government is saying do that. Now, of course, the president's executive order is under a constant review and appeal. So they are stuck, but, and that's why we're trying to repeal this law, this regulation, I should say, so that now only federal law is the only thing you should worry about complying with.
So that kind of leads to my other question about the challenge, where you're challenging through the lawsuit both the federal and state laws. So what are your legal arguments for that?
Well, there are many. The motions, there's a hearing. They tried to dismiss the case. They were not successful in dismissing the case. So that's kind of a win in one regard. And they didn't want to release certain records, but under threat of a subpoena from a arbiter, they did. So we've had kind of two minor wins in this, but it's going to be tough to win this case. There's another Supreme Court ruling that could come into play here, Sherry, and that's the Chevron case, where basically the Supreme Court says you do not have to give extraordinary preference to the administrative state if they've done something wrong. Well, the administrative state in Rhode Island is saying the transgender guidelines of Obama and Department of Education here are the law. So I think we're going to throw that into the mix as well as saying, look, you don't have to, Mr. and Mrs. Judge, you don't have to defer or give great deference to state bureaucrats anymore in these agencies. So let's look at this for the merits. Let's start with a clean slate. But even politically, we're in an impossible, difficult situation legislatively. Even judicially, the courts are stacked with left-leaning judges. There's no question about that. But so that's why we're also because we don't think we can win alone on the moral case, on the look what happened to Jane Doe and her daughter. That's why we think this legal technicality is important. That they lied. They flat out lied in putting together this statewide transgender regulation, misstated state law, and we need to call them on it.
And I think added to that is the fact that they told the daughter to lie to her parents. I think that's outrageous. Not that that's probably a great legal argument, but it is a strong moral argument, as you suggested. So, Mike, we need to take a short break, but when we come back, I'd like to ask you about the price this mother has had to pay for taking on the system. Don't go away. I'll be right back with my interview with Mike Stenhouse right after this. A Michigan high school recently approved an expressly pro-Hamas position for a student debate while turning down the option to present a pro-Israel perspective, in effect endorsing arguments in defense of an international terrorist group. A New York City elementary school engaged in Jewish erasure when a classroom map of the Middle East identified all countries except Israel, which was labeled Palestine. Incidents like these illustrate how the indoctrination of impressionable minds leads to anarchy, evidenced by an increase in anti-Semitic activity on college campuses by students who have been radicalized. U.S. Parents Involved in Education believes that the next generation must be rescued by restoring education to its local roots, controlled by parents. Tune in next week for more insights from U.S. Parents Involved in Education and connect with us at USPI on X and Facebook. To join the movement, visit uspi.org. Welcome back to Unmasking Government Schools with Sherry Few. With me today is Mike Stenhouse, CEO of the Rhode Island Center for Freedom and Prosperity. Mike, your press release mentioned that Jane Doe even lost her job at the school district. So how else has this case impacted her personally, and why should it matter to every parent in America?
It's just tragedy after tragedy what happened, in this case with taking advantage of an emotionally disturbed, sexually abused young girl, shoving this social and emotional learning stuff in front of her, secretly helping her with her transition. And her mother at the time did work for the school district in a, kind of a lower level administrative capacity. And when she asked for time off after the suicide attempt, all right, just think about this. There's a mother dealing with a daughter who the school district itself kept secret and tried to transition it secretly from the mother. Then when she tries to commit suicide and the mother wants to take some time off to spend with her daughter and help her recover, not only do they not grant her the medical leave, but shortly thereafter they fire her or they don't renew her contract. Same thing. So it took her a while to get back to work. These are not wealthy people. So the courage of her to come forward, I think the Moms for Liberty group was very helpful in giving her the knowledge and the courage to speak out. And when we talked to her, we know that most people aren't. And you're just like a rape victim. They don't want to speak out. But she was ready and she was eager. She says this cannot happen to other kids. It just cannot happen. We have to get the word out there. So thank you for helping to raise some national awareness about this case. I mean, I'm not aware of a case more tragic than this one, and I hope it gets even more attention. We do have a hearing coming up in the middle of August in Rhode Island Superior Court. She's a hero in my eyes for speaking out. The daughter is estranged from her now because the daughter's not happy with the. We didn't want to give any more publicity, but the daughter is now living with the divorced father who supports the transition, and Jane herself does not even know how far it's gone, if there's been surgery or hormones or chemical castration or anything like that, because she's lost her relationship with her daughter as well.
It's so sad.
Terrible.
Yes, it is terrible. And I just wanted to add one thing about the sexual assault that she was a victim of when she was 5 years old that you mentioned early on. I was telling you before the show that I interviewed Walt Heyer, who's an 84-year-old man who transitioned, and he asked me not to call it that anymore, and I'll explain why. But many years ago, and then came to know the Lord and realized it was a lie, and went back to being the man that he is. And as a result of that, he had a lot of courage, a lot like Jane Doe here, where he wanted to help other people and warn them so that they didn't have to go through the pain and suffering, the emotional trauma that he went through. And so one of the things he pointed out to me, because he has a website where people can go to his website and ask him questions if they're concerned about what's happening to their child, or if it's the individual themselves when it comes to this issue. And he has learned over the years, and he's been at this about 40 years, that every single case, there's some sort of trauma in the child's life that has caused them to, have a mental health issue. And then it's seized upon, if you will, by those adults, like those in the school district, to try to push them into this harmful lifestyle. So it's interesting that the sexual assault is kind of the common thread. And he said it's not always sexual assault, but often it is, because they're sexually abused. They don't like their body, and they don't want that to happen again. So they think being the opposite sex will prevent that from happening again.
I mean, I don't know that they specifically targeted Jane Doe's daughter here, but certainly they're fishing, right? They're through with these SEL surveys. They're fishing for someone who, okay, yeah, that sounds interesting. And it's weaker people usually who are attracted to this.
Right. And that's the common thread. So the critics say that policies like these are gender affirming. And by the way, Walt says that we shouldn't call it transitioning because it's impossible to transition. You're either a boy or a girl. You're not going to become one or the other. So he's encouraged me to call it identity confusion. So I'm trying to adopt that new vernacular. And we know that gender is a social construct, that medically and legally the term is sex. So I try to encourage people not to adopt their terminology so we can keep the truth in the forefront.
I like to throw their terminology back at them. I call it gender denying care.
So, that's anyway, good too. I like that. So anyway, they like to say it's gender affirming and compassionate. But many doctors and mental health professionals, one of whom I've interviewed recently on the podcast, argue that they are anything but. So what should real compassion look like for children experiencing this mental health disorder?
This case shows that the great myth that the left has spun about all this. Well, if you don't provide this gender denying care, my term, then your child might try to commit suicide. Well, here we have a child that went through the gender denying care and still ended up trying to commit suicide. And studies have now shown that the transitioning process, to use that term, does not reduce the risk of suicidal thoughts. So reality is, and God's truth, I'm sorry, God's truth and reality is the best medicine, I think. It might hurt at first, it might hurt, but getting them on a path to reality is the best thing we can do for any young child, especially for those who have fallen off the path.
Amen.
That's compassion. That's
Amen.
compassion. Setting them up for a happy and prosperous life for the rest of their lives.
I couldn't agree more. So, what would you say to parents who feel powerless as these ideologies invade their schools? And what practical steps can they take to protect their children and hold school systems accountable?
Well, I think, depending on how some of these executive orders and Supreme Court rulings get adjudicated, either in the cases in front of us or in gray area cases that are sure to follow, there's, the opt out, on the materials, that the Supreme Court just mandated is going to be big. So take advantage of that opt out, demand that your school district tell you what their transparency and notification rules will be. Look carefully at the curricula, and then demand that they give you an easy and effective opt out process. So I think that's the best thing we can do is to take advantage of this ruling to shield kids from any of this controversial and immoral material that schools are putting out. And it's not just the sexual stuff. It's not just the LGBTQ stuff. We've been fighting, critical race theory type stuff. Our state Department of Education has a social studies standards that are just completely Marxist. I mean, it's unthinkable. We wrote a 52-page report pointing all that out about a year and a half ago. So there's this whole effort to indoctrinate our kids in any number of disciplines is to me the biggest problem we have in education, and why parental school choice with public funds following the student to the school of their family's choice is so ultra important right now, because of these public schools that continue to try to indoctrinate our kids with false narratives. We got to give parents some options.
So I agree with you about all of that. And our organization encourages parents to get their kids out of government schools. It's just that toxic. And so we know it can be challenging for some families to be able to do that. And that's why the school choice alternative that's so popular today seems like a good option. But I'll just have to share with you briefly, Mike, because it's a whole nother topic. But our organization is concerned about government money going into private and home education because, it's one of the UN goals to control all education in the world through the government schools. And it is actually something they recommend through the UNESCO. So we prefer something called tax credits. And we have some policies in some states and not federal tax credits, because we don't believe the federal government has any legal standing in education, because it's not in the Constitution. It's not something that the federal government was delineated to do. So we are opposed. We love Trump. We love his executive orders and so many of the good things he's done, but we're not wild about his latest voucher program that's through the big, beautiful bill. But again, that's a topic for another day, and maybe you and I can do some one-on-one about that.
Quickly, the money following the student isn't necessarily bad unless there are strings attached to that money, and that's what you're talking about. And we understand those concerns.
Right.
But if the money can be available without strings, then we don't see any harm in that. But we can talk about that another time. Yep.
Well, and the best way to do that is to give the parent a tax credit. And if you want to do it on the federal level, then you just increase the child tax credit that every parent receives. So if they get, I don't know, $3,000 or $4,000 a child,
one way to do it. I agree.
Up it to $10,000. That way they keep more of their own money, and there's no threat of strings being attached later, which is what our concern is. We need to take another short break, but when I come back, I'd like to ask you 2 questions I ask all my guests before closing the show. Don't go away. I'll be back with my interview with Mike Stenhouse right after this. In March of 2023, U.S. Parents Involved in Education announced the Millstone of the Month Award, modeled after the Bible verse, Matthew 18:6, which says, "Whoever causes one of these little ones who believes in me to sin, it would be better for him to have a great millstone fastened around his neck and to be drowned in the depth of the sea." The Millstone Award is given to people involved in government schools who have committed egregious acts against children. Sadly, there's a recipient every month with multiple finalists, reflective of the tragic state of American education. Recipients of the Millstone of the Month Award can be found at uspi.org under Resources. Tune in next week for more insights from U.S. Parents Involved in Education and connect with us at USPI on X and Facebook. U.S. Parents Involved in Education's mission is to empower parents to break free from federal education influence. To join the movement, visit uspi.org. Welcome back to Unmasking Government Schools with Sherry Few. With me today has been Mike Stenhouse, CEO of Rhode Island Center for Freedom and Prosperity. Mike, we always close our show with two important questions, but first I'd like to congratulate you on being named to the 2025 class of the College Baseball Hall of Fame. Congratulations, Mike. That's awesome.
I didn't even know until about a month ago there was such a thing, and I just celebrated our 45th reunion with not only my roommates and classmates, but members of our class's baseball team at Harvard University. So I was up in Cambridge and just spent a whole nice weekend with all my baseball teammates who are like family to me, and then I find out a few days later that I'm going to receive this honor. So it's been it was a shock. I didn't even know such a thing existed. So I am more than honored. Mark McGuire is going to be going into the same Hall of Fame, and as well as some other really great names. So I am humbled and honored beyond words.
Well, that's awesome. Well, we celebrate with you. That's great. So we always close our show with two important questions. What concerns you most about what's happening in education today, and what gives you hope?
Well, I think I alluded to that a little while ago. It's just this effort to indoctrinate kids, no matter what the issue. And I don't care if it's left wing, right wing, conservative, liberal, woke, whatever you want, even libertarian. That's not what schools are for. Schools are not social equity, social justice laboratories. Schools are to learn core topics, to learn how to learn, and to learn how to interact with your peers. I think kids naturally will accept their peers no matter what their preferences might be, no matter what racial background they have. It's only when adults start trying to persuade them to believe one way or the other that we can create the divisiveness. And it's not just for the students. I mean, you've heard the stories, you've probably been there, and I have, but the divisiveness this is causing in our communities that should be close knit. I mean, jeepers, if we can't commonly rally around our students in a school, and every school function has to be a fight because we're fighting over these controversial and immoral school policies where they're trying to indoctrinate kids one way or the other, it's got to stop. So it's got to stop. We got to return to the basics of education. What gives me hope? God's truth. His truth is marching on. That's my favorite song, Battle Hymn of the Republic. His truth will prevail. And many, many, many more people, from President Trump and many others, you look at happening, even the Supreme Court, I think, and other, to an extent. We're going to win this battle. Eventually, it's going to take some time, unfortunately. We hope that more children and families like Jane Doe and her daughter don't have to go through some kind of tragedy to get us there. But we're gonna win this because it's God's truth. It's really that simple. His truth, it will march on, and we will prevail. It's just sad that we have to be in the fight at all.
Amen. Well, I like your hope. That's encouraging. So the other point we like to make as an organization, and I know you feel the same, is that if we don't stop the indoctrination of children in government schools, we're going to lose what freedom we have left in this country, because that's the intentional agenda, and that's why it's set up as a Marxist system, because they want to pit people groups against one another. And we see the division in our country, especially among young people. So it's that important. It's important not only to protect children, which is the priority, but also to protect our country's freedom. So, Mike, go ahead.
Just one quick comment. I'm not sure what to make of it, but they say that the Gen Zers, who themselves have been going through this indoctrination, they're probably the first group that are becoming among the most religious and conservative. It's almost like they're rejecting it. It seems to me that the white liberal and other intellectual parents are the ones who are being indoctrinated more than the kids. So I don't know. So if that's true about the Gen Z generation, that also gives me hope.
Amen. Yes, that's a good note to end on. So, Mike, I just want to thank you for standing up for families and for shining a light on this dangerous trend in our education system. So tell our viewers where they can go to learn more about this case and support your work.
Well, I've got two pretty simple addresses to give you. To learn more about Jane Doe, go to our media website, oceanstatecurrent.com/Jane-Doe. oceanstatecurrent.com/Jane-Doe to learn more about our law center's work on this, our referral letter to the federal government. That's my organization's main website, rifreedom.org/Title IX, Title IX. So Jane-Doe on oceanstatecurrent.com and Title IX, Title IX on rifreedom.org.
Okay, great. And to our listeners and viewers, thank you for tuning in to Unmasking Government Schools with Sherry Few. If this episode encouraged you or challenged you, please consider sharing it with a friend. And be sure to visit uspie.org to learn more and join the movement. See you next time.
U.S. Parents Involved in Education is a nonprofit coalition dedicated to restoring local control of education and parental authority. By empowering parents to reclaim responsibility for their children's learning and encouraging states to move away from federal influence, USPI seeks to create a culture where parents are the primary decision makers in education and schools support families without the burden of federal mandates. If you want to start a state or regional USPI chapter in your area, please visit uspie.org and complete the brief questionnaire in the chapters section.